Have you ever felt overwhelmed when it comes to the Stephen King universe? I have been reading through all of his books for my podcast, Chat Cemetery. I'm going in chronological order, and as I've been reading along, I've been finding that so many books connect to one another, and even though some books take place in entirely different universes, there are still these connections that King is making. I'm Deanna Chapman, and today I am going to break down the connection between it and the Dark Tower series. It is known as one of King's longest and best horror novels, and I know that it's probably not everyone's favorite novel of his necessarily, but I do think it's one of his more recognizable novels because of the miniseries from the 90s and then the recent two movies that have sort of just catapulted it even further into how popular some of these King books end up being. And what a lot of people probably don't know if they haven't read the Dark Tower series is that there are all of these little connections that King makes with his other books, and it happens to be one of those books that has a handful of connections to the Dark Tower world, basically. And one of the first connections, and probably the easiest one to make, is Derry, which is a town in Maine that is a fictional town which Stephen King just made up for the stories. And the key here is that most of it takes place in Derry, and minor spoilers for it and the Dark Tower series here, but in the Dark Tower series, Roland makes a pit stop in Derry, Maine, and he visits Stephen King himself, who, yes, wrote himself in as a character into his own books, which doesn't surprise me, but at the same time kind of surprised me when I was reading through the Dark Tower series. But that connection there is just sort of this more surface level connection because it's the same town. And then you have the fact that the turtle appears in both the It novel and the Dark Tower series. So the turtle, Maturin, is one of the guardians that holds up one of the beams to the Dark Tower, which is how you have that connection. And even though Maturin is more so a spectator in it, you still have that connection there where Pennywise, or It, is telling Bill that Maturin is dead, and that is confirmed. And you have sort of that big consequence to, what happens if the beams aren't holding up the Dark Tower anymore. And I really feel like even though that part of it is such a small part of the book, that's sort of the big connection to the Dark Tower series. Everything else is just kind of a little nod here and there. Like I said, Derry was a more surface level connection. But there are still a couple more things to mention, one of which is Legion. In the 2003 version of The Gunslinger, you have a character named Walter who mentions that Legion is this end-world creature. And then in The Drains in Derry, you hear these voices that go by the name Legion. So it isn't super clear if there's only one Legion or there are more than one, and each one is sort of its separate thing, but the name is the connection there. One of the more fun connections, though, is the fact that you have a robot named Stuttering Bill in the Dark Tower series, and if you've read it, you know that the main character, Bill Denborough, has a stutter, so therefore he ends up with the nickname Stuttering Bill. And even though Stuttering Bill in the Dark Tower series is not the actual Bill Denborough, the fact that there's a robot built that looks like this character is just one of those things where it's not super important to the story, but it's just a fun little connection to make between these two novels, basically, because that actually only pops up in one of the Dark Tower books. You also have the Deadlights, which ties Pennywise to the Crimson King, and there was some speculation that Pennywise and Dandello might be the same character, but Stephen King has nixed that, and it just seems likely that they are of the same species. So there's sort of that whole connection between Pennywise, the character, and the rest of the Dark Tower series as well. Then you have a connection that probably doesn't even really matter remotely at all, but there's a moment in the Dark Tower series where Jake sees this wallpaper that has elves on it, and then there's a similar wallpaper in It at the main house where the Losers Club encounters Pennywise, and that's another one of those things where if you aren't paying attention enough, that's something that will slide by, and in the grand scheme of things, doesn't really matter because it's not something that impacts the story in any sort of way, but they're just these little connections and Easter eggs that I like to try and pick out and mention, especially on the podcast, but I'm hoping to dive into more of them in future videos. So if you like this video, hit the like button, consider subscribing, and you can follow me on social media at the links in the show description, which is where you can also find my podcasts, Chat Cemetery and Welcome to Geekdom. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.